Hey guys, welcome back. So really quick, I only have like 10 minutes to do this video. I'm actually on break in my social psychology class, and we've been having a really interesting, tentative discussion on um, social identity, race, right? And I find it to be quite interesting how people have different perspectives when it comes to social identity and race and social constructs. We're talking about how one's identity can be empowering or debilitating, right? So depending on how you identify yourself, it can be problematic, or it can be a benefit, right? And someone brought up the whole idea how depending on one's social context, that also can be debilitating. So, for example, in a certain social setting, let's say the classroom, where in America it's expected that children sit still, are very controlled, and they don't get up. They're not as active. They have to sit still and be able to control themselves and their behaviors, right? And anything outside of that is considered to be hyperactive. And how basically, essentially, the classroom setting creates a disability for that child. Whereas if that child was placed in a different setting where that expectation wasn't a standard, then they wouldn't be looked at as hyperactive or ADHD. And so I brought up the whole idea how African Americans, if we were to go to Africa, Black people were to go to Africa, how essentially we would not be a minority, but only in America are we considered a minority. And someone brought up the idea that, well, actually, that's not true, because in Africa, some of them may look at us as a minority because we're American. They're like, you're not really like us because you're an American. So I find it to be quite interesting. I want to talk to you guys a little bit briefly about that and kind of get you guys' input on how do you see yourselves. I know a lot of times some Black people, I even brought up in my social psych class, how a lot of African Americans don't even want to identify themselves as African. They don't have any kind of association with Africa because of the stigma associated with the name itself. Like, these social constructs are really powerful. Like I said, they can be empowering or they can be debilitating, depending on the associations that the society has made with that particular term. And we know that there's a lot of stigma with the name African American. Although for us, within our culture who take pride in the African race, we esteem ourselves very high. We make positive associations. The overarching social construct in which we live, the overall society in which we live, this context in which we live, basically doesn't see it as that, especially in America. And so I want to ask you guys, I actually did a survey with like about 50 authors on my website at behappy.org, spelled BIHAPI.org. It's a website, organization, research, actually a lab that I created around my research. So I have a research lab called Be Happy, but I created an organization around my research lab, to take it a little step further, to offer programs and interventions for African Americans and even Africans within the diaspora. And I did a survey, about 50 authors, and I asked them, how do they identify themselves as African or Black, or, neither, just how do you identify yourself? And it's interesting, some of the responses, how some Black people don't identify themselves as African, and some actually would prefer to identify themselves as American, but not African American, just simply American, So I find it to be quite ironic. But back to the whole idea that, we may be perceived as a minority in Africa, to me, that speaks to basically how one defines the construct. I feel like the whole idea of minority can be defined based on one's racial makeup or ethnic makeup, or it can be defined based on one's nationality, and sometimes people do identify themselves more with their nationality than with the race. I think that's a really interesting study to see how Africans perceive African Americans. Do they look at us as, are you more of an American, or do they accept the fact that we are African descendants too? We're African. I find it to be quite ironic, that it was brought up in my class, and I love having these kinds of discussions. Like we're always, that's the reason why like I love academia. And I think I have a everlasting marriage to educational institutions because I like to engage in intellectual conversations and discussions. And that's all we do, especially at the graduate level. Most of the classes are like seminars and they're interactive. So we get to have these conversations, these very stimulating conversations that get our minds wondering, you know? It definitely made me think, and it's not something that it just came up this first time. This is not the first time it's come up. For me, I mean, I've had conversations like that before with even other Africans, people born in Africa. And it's unfortunate that we have these social constructs that divide us. You know, it's like you have African, then you have African Americans. It's like Africans who were born in Africa don't sometimes accept us as Africans because we're American, you know, and how they will identify more closely with a white African than they will an African American just because they share the same nationality, you know. So it gets kind of tricky, but I do know African Americans who are working collaboratively with Africans in Africa to establish a bridge, and I'm one of them actually, to establish a bridge between African Americans and Africans. I think that's really important because we do share that commonality, you know? And it's just like some of us, unfortunately, put the nation or our nation above our biological race, you know? It gets tricky. It gets really tricky. But ultimately, like I said, I still hold firm to my belief that outside of America, we're not minorities, you know? And I think it's interesting how people change social constructs and the way they define it so that we will always be a minority no matter where we go. You know, essentially that's kind of what my professor was kind of alluding to, saying that, okay, well, even if you go to Africa, you will still be considered a minority because they don't see us as Africans. They see us more as Americans. And I'm like, I don't think so. And even when I'm among other Africans, I don't feel like a minority. I feel included. Like I feel like we are all the same, you know, because we share this African DNA, you know, which is really, really important to me. So I don't feel isolated. I don't feel different. Now, yes, we know a lot of Africans speak, you know, some speak a different dialect, a different tongue, but most speak English. A lot of Africans that I've encountered speak English, even the ones that I work with at my practicum site. There are some Africans there, and, you know, I gravitate to them. It's interesting to see how, like, Black people, no matter where we are, you know, we can be in America, we can be outside of America, but Black people, we have the tendency, people gravitate to other people based on, you know, their physical characteristics. And then they get to know, okay, oh, you're from this country or that country. I'm thinking, like, let's say, for example, we were to do an experiment. We were to take Africans, no matter the country, right, but African, in one room, whether you are American, South American, Europe, Jamaican, no matter which country you're from, right? Or even from Africa, put, let's say, 1,000 Africans in one room, intermingle with other races. I just feel like naturally you're going to see Africans gravitating towards other Africans, no matter the nationality that the other Africans are from. I just think that's my hypothesis, that's what you'll see, you know? And then they will get to understand, okay, we're from different countries, we speak different languages, you know, then they may go into different subsets based on that once they begin to communicate. But I still feel like, even still, because I've seen this play out, you know, I've seen this play out in many different settings, like whether it's at an educational institution or a work environment or just a casual social setting, where you will have different types of Africans, you know, whether you're American or you're from Africa or Europe, you know, It's like you have different kinds of Africans amongst other people from other races, but somehow we tend to attract each other. We come together, you know, naturally. Like the black people just go with the black people, and then the white people go with their kind. That's just how I think naturally the people within the human species behave and operate. You see that, and I think it's based on our phenotype, the physical differences that we see amongst each other. You know, we tend to attract to people who look like us, you know, not necessarily people who we share the same nation with, you know, or even the same language, but people who look like us. Language is also obviously a factor in it because it's how we are able to communicate, you know, but I feel like a lot of Africans across the diaspora anyway speak English, you know, so I don't think that would be an inhibiting factor to uniting Africans. I don't think that. I think that naturally we just gravitate towards each other, and I stand firm on my belief that we are a minority. When we go outside of America, you know, we come together and we recognize that it is our race, it is our African identity that is what makes us strong, and that's what keeps us strong. You know, that's what unites us, essentially. So that's just my take on it. You know, someone else brought up the point that, oh, it well, depends on what part of Africa you go, because South Africa is a lot of white people. And I'm just like, no, but still there's a lot of black people in South Africa. I think, what is a racial demographic in South Africa? I think it's like 50%, I want to say, that we make up of the population. I want to say we're still dominant in Africa, but either way, I have to check. Oh, I gotta go, you guys. See how fast the time goes by? Time flies when we're having fun. But that's just my take on it. I want to hear what you guys have to say. If you feel comfortable sharing how you identify yourself, I think that's really important. But I just think that Africans, we strong wherever we go and we stick together, and I've seen it happen. You know, I've been, like I said, in social contexts where it's been white people or Asians, you know, Latinos, Italians, and Africans, and somehow, you know, no matter if it's a natural born Africa from Africa or an African American, we just bind to each other. We stick together. We naturally gravitate. You know, that's happened. I've seen that happen in so many different contexts, just me personally, and I want to hear from you guys. But let me go. I have more to say on this topic, on, you know, how social constructs can empower us, they can debilitate us, depending. I think that's a lot of reasons why people, African Americans specifically, choose to not identify themselves as African, because of the stigma associated with that, unfortunately. And it ties into one's survival, because the labels that we wear, identity that we wear, affects our psychology, affects our physical health, physiology, and our survival ultimately, you know? So I don't like sometimes when people try to criticize some Africans because they don't seem like they strongly identify with the African race. It's like they're sellouts because they don't want to be associated with, you know, their race. But sometimes it's about survival. You know, we talk about that even in my class. Like it's kind of more of a subconscious thing. It happens it's not even something that they're cognitively aware of a lot of times. It's just something that naturally happens because it's an adaptive mechanism, a way for them to survive and adapt in the context in which we live, which is America, you know, a white racist society. But hey, I gotta go. My break is over. I just wanted to share that because the conversation is interesting, and we're about to go back to class and continue to have this very interesting conversation. I love having conversations like this with my colleagues. And I gotta go. Catch you guys later. Love you guys. Bye.